Hi everyone. Wow, loud. My name is Jacob Hoffman-Andrews. I'm a senior staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I work on Let's Encrypt, Cert Bot, and I used to work on HTTPS everywhere. More broadly, I work on EFF's Encrypt the Web initiative, which I'll talk about in a minute. The staff technologist position at EFF, I like to describe as a kind of dual class coder/blogger. You know, we try to make change on EFF's issue areas both through code and writing programs, and also through analysis and blogging and the more traditional activist type of activity. We also advise the EFF's lawyers on emerging technology and help them build the best cases they possibly can. So EFF has been working to encrypt the web since approximately 2009 or 2010. And you know, the goal there is we'd like every page on the internet to use HTTPS. And you know, HTTPS is this really remarkable technology in that you know, it's encryption that makes available the best algorithms, you know, or some of the best algorithms we have that are actually used by you know, very high security applications. But it's in literally every smartphone out there and every computer, and you can just use it without even thinking about it every day. And so that's why it's such an appealing technology for us to promote the use of. Ideally, you want every web page encrypted, and the reason for that is, you know, there's a lot of surveillance that can happen just passively by seeing what web pages you visit, what you send and receive to those web pages. You know, now like email is a web page, social media is a web page, and so if somebody can, you know, see what you're doing on those pages, they can see everything. And it's actually a technology that has very little downside. I'll touch on some of the downsides in a bit, but it, you know, for the end user, they don't have to learn how to use it. They don't have to learn what a public key is or what a private key is. So far, the web in general, with EFF's activism, has been making really great progress on this front. We have numbers from Firefox telemetry as of 2015, which also happens to be when Let's Encrypt launched. And 38% of page loads across the web, just from a sample of Firefox users, used HTTPS. That number is now up to 65% and still increasing. And in fact, the rate of increase is also increasing. There's some data available before that, but it's hard to get to. It's actually got deleted from Firefox's telemetry servers. But basically, we're kind of up and to the right, from your perspective, up and to the right on encrypting the web. One of the big obstacles to more prevalent adoption of HTTPS has been kind of two main things: cost and difficulty, which is really just another type of cost. You know, so when HTTPS and SSL were first developed, so you had to get a certificate from a paid certificate authority, and those could cost hundreds of dollars every year. Even in 2015, when Let's Encrypt launched, you know, you would still pay at least $15 a year for your certificate, which doesn't seem like a lot necessarily here in San Francisco, but you know, in a lot of the world, that's a lot of money, and especially, I'm sure a lot of you have open source projects that you do for free, and you know, shelling out even 15 bucks a year for this like free project just seems like an unnecessary burden, and that prevented a lot of people from getting their certificates. But in a way, you know, the even more significant burden was the expertise and the effort and the time. Right around the time we announced Let's Encrypt, we did a little in-house user testing to see, okay, just how hard is it to set up a certificate. And with like, you know, a very technical coworker of mine, you know, who had some experience and knew all the concepts already, it took him 3 hours to set up just a basic, you know, HTTPS certificate on a website. And, you know, time is like an even bigger cost than money, because, you know, some people just don't have it, or you just don't have the expertise. And so we want to make a web where everyone can access the benefits of HTTPS without having to be a technical wizard and without having to have a lot of money. And so Let's Encrypt solves both of these problems. One, expense. So Let's Encrypt is a certificate authority, which I can get into in a minute, that gives away certificates for free. So anybody can get a Let's Encrypt certificate for free. But more importantly, it uses a standardized protocol called ACME, which is just kind of a made-up acronym. But this allows people to write clients for any sort of hosting provider or system they want that can interact with Let's Encrypt, and in fact can also interact with other CAs that will in the future implement ACME themselves. So you can still choose your own CA. We don't want Let's Encrypt to be the only automated CA. We want this to be CA, Certificate Authority. We want this to be the standard for everyone. And that allows us to tie in this other key piece of software written at EFF called Cert Bot. So Let's Encrypt and Cert Bot kind of go hand in hand. Cert Bot is the client that speaks the ACME protocol and does the interaction with the Let's Encrypt servers and says, hey, I want a cert for example.com. By the way, to expand, certificate, same thing. I want a certificate for example.com, and the ACME server, generally Let's Encrypt, says, okay, I need to prove that you actually control example.com. I don't want to just give out these certificates willy-nilly. So you're going to need to put this specific file at this specific path on your web server. Or I'm going to do a TLS handshake with your web server, and I'm going to expect to see this certain value in the response. Or I want you to put this specific value in the DNS for this name related to your website. And CertBot can automatically do that for you. It'll set that up. And in fact, one of the coolest things about it, it knows how to do that setup for various different web servers, including Apache and Nginx. So you don't need to do any extra configuration. If you have an Apache web server, or if you have an Nginx web server, you can just tell CertBot, do it all for me, and it'll talk to Let's Encrypt. It will set up the response for your web server. It'll tell Let's Encrypt, come verify me. Once that's done, it'll say, okay, now I want that certificate for real, now that I've proved that I own this website. And then once that's done, it'll actually install that certificate in your web browser configuration. And that's actually one of the big areas where there are both a lot of time-consuming errors and also just errors that people don't notice. So sometimes you visit a website, and it says the certificate doesn't match, or it has the wrong name, or it's expired. And some of those can be attributed to misconfiguration. So by automating things, we reduce a lot of the opportunities for misconfiguration. We also automate basically everything on the server side, which eliminates a lot of opportunities for human error in operating the CA. So we've seen in the past few years more and more CAs being caught making serious mistakes, like issuing certificates for domains that they haven't validated. And most of those mistakes can be attributed to kind of human error. Somebody was manually going in and issuing a certificate, and they didn't follow the right procedures. So by automating a lot of things on the server side, we can also produce a more robust and reliable certificate authority. I realize at this point I should probably clarify what a certificate authority does. So a certificate authority issues certificates. So these are cryptographically signed files that indicate a mapping between a set of domain names and a public key. So as the administrator of a website, you would get this certificate, and it would contain your website's public key in it. That way, when somebody comes to visit your website, your web server would provide that certificate to prove to the web browser that if you use this public key to communicate with me, our communications will be safe. Whereas if you use some other public key that you got from an untrusted source, you can't be sure that those communications will be safe. So that's how you know that you're communicating with a specific web server and not a man-in-the-middle web server. I'd also like to take the opportunity, since we're here talking a lot about kind of open access and access to information, to talk about kind of how encrypting the web actually helps that. At EFF we have this project called openwireless.org, where we want to encourage lots of people to run open wireless access points with no access control. But in the Wi-Fi world, access control and encryption are tied together. If you want your Wi-Fi data to be encrypted to your access point, you have to have a key on it. And it used to be people would say, don't get on the coffee shop network, that's not secure. Don't get on public Wi-Fi, that's not secure. Anybody can read what you're saying. And increasingly, because of the success of the Encrypt the Web movement, that's not true anymore. It's much safer today to get on open Wi-Fi than it was even a few years ago, because most of the sites you're likely to visit are using HTTPS. So just because somebody's listening on that Wi-Fi connection doesn't mean they can collect much of your data or impersonate you by stealing cookies off of your web connections. And I think this is important to mention because I talked some about what are the downsides of HTTPS, and there are some downsides in terms of requiring HTTPS for websites will slightly increase barriers to getting on the web. Right now, if you want to get on the web, you need to have hosting, you need to have an IP address, and you need to have a domain name. Each of those is a little bit of a barrier, makes it a little bit harder. And if you're going to need a certificate in the future, that's also another little bit of a barrier. And we're very aware of that. And that's why we want Let's Encrypt to have the lowest possible barriers. And we think on average the balance of more encryption and protecting people from both surveillance and more targeted hacking, which I'll get to in a minute, is more valuable than this incremental increase. Let's Encrypt also, in terms of having low barriers, has a lot of policies around. We're very conservative about revoking certificates because we know that will take somebody's website offline. And so we really want to avoid certificate authorities and HTTPS becoming a mechanism to take speech off of the web. Talking a little briefly about the more targeted hacking aspects of HTTPS, a lot of people are familiar with how surveillance can be used on plain HTTP, and you can collect what pages somebody's visiting. But there's also this authentication part of HTTPS that says the data you're getting from this website is actually from that website. And if you don't have that on any given website, stuff can be injected. So you may have seen this, like if you use Wi-Fi on an airplane, they might stick in a banner that says, here's how far to your destination. Or if you're on Comcast, they might stick in JavaScript that sets up ads for Comcast themselves. There's any number of these kind of annoying and negative interventions that are done on HTTP, but it can get actually more severe. So from the Snowden documents, we know that NSA and GCHQ have tools to inject similar JavaScript that contains kind of any payload they want. It can set a tracking cookie, or if they have a zero-day handy. Zero-day is a bug that can be used to attack your computer. If they're willing to use one of these bugs that can take over your browser, they can inject one of those. So any HTTP access carries a risk. Now, for most people, that's a fairly low risk, but we'd like to create an ecosystem where everyone is jointly protected by everybody being on HTTPS for most or all of the web browsing experience. There was another really interesting abuse of HTTP, I think about 2 years ago, that got dubbed the Great Canon, where many websites embed JavaScript from Baidu, which is a Chinese search giant, kind of like the Chinese Google. So they just have a little analytics JavaScript. So from wherever you are on the internet, if you're browsing a site that includes Baidu Analytics, that request goes to Baidu's servers behind the Chinese Great Firewall. And what the Chinese government presumably, it's not been proven, but what appears to have been done is that when those requests would go to Baidu, a server in between would shoot back a fake response that included some fake JavaScript that would turn your computer very temporarily into kind of a minion attacking GitHub by sending it repeated requests for a given page. And this was like a really difficult to remediate distributed denial of service for GitHub because the traffic came from real users' browsers on real computers and all over the internet. It was very hard to isolate specific patterns. And this attack would not have been possible if Baidu was using HTTPS for their analytics links. And in general, if the whole web was HTTPS, these type of attacks would not be possible. The other thing we're trying to do at Let's Encrypt is improve the certificate authority ecosystem. So, for a long time, certificate authorities have been thought of as a big security vulnerability in the internet. And indeed, the whole ecosystem of how certificate authorities work is rather dangerous. There are several dozens, probably on the order of 100, depending on how you count, certificate authorities that are trusted by major browsers. And generally speaking, any one of those certificate authorities can issue for Google.com or Yahoo.com or Facebook.com and be trusted by your browser. So, if any CA goes rogue and issues a bad certificate with a bad public key, that certificate can be used to intercept traffic that would otherwise have been secure and, for instance, access people's accounts improperly. There have been various efforts to kind of lock down and restrict that access and make the certificate authority ecosystem safer. So one of these is called CAA, Certificate Authority Authorization. And this is a record you can put in DNS for your domain name that says, you know what, I only do business with this one CA or with these two CAs, and they're the only ones who are allowed to issue for me. And if any other CA checks this record and sees that they're not listed, they should refuse to issue. Now, this doesn't protect against the rogue CA case, but it does, in some cases, protect against human error and hacking at certain levels of the system. So, for instance, DigiNotar was a CA that was compromised several years back, and that might have been prevented by CAA. So this was an interesting specification in that it was standardized in 2013 and was implemented by a couple of CAs, but they implemented it in advisory mode. So if you added this record and they saw they weren't allowed to issue, all that would do is send that on to somebody to say, thumbs up, thumb down. It wouldn't actually stop them from issuing. So it was hard to see whether this was really effective. The other issue with CAA is that it's most effective only when all CAs are required to check it. So when Let's Encrypt launched, we decided we were going to be the first CA that would enforce this CAA record on every issuance we did. And it turned out it was fine. There had been resistance by a number of CAs saying it would hurt their business, or it would be too slow, or there would be too many errors. So by demonstrating that it's possible to add this extra bit of security, we were able to take that to this industry group that sets the rules for CAs and say, look, this is possible. It's not that hard. You can do thousands of these requests per second. Let's just do this. And so we got a ballot passed. And as of September this year, all CAs, including Let's Encrypt, are required to check this extra security record. Another really neat piece of technology that's improving certificate security is called certificate transparency. And it was developed at Google. It's actually similar to an idea that my coworker Peter developed called sovereign keys. It's based on a Merkle tree construction, which may be familiar from blockchain style things. Except rather than be distributed, it's, each certificate transparency log resides generally with a single organization. And the Merkle tree properties are used to provide tamper-resistant append-only properties. So if you're looking at a CT log, you can verify the data in this hasn't been tampered since I last saw it. Things have only been added. And the purpose of these logs is for certificate authorities to submit every certificate they issue so that they can be audited by the public. And so, if somebody issues a certificate that they shouldn't have, we as the public can see it. and the owner of the website it was issued for can see it and can take action to get it stopped and possibly have sanctions put upon the CA involved. The long-term plan is for Chrome is planning to require CT submission in order to trust certificates. And there's a little bit of data you can include with an issued certificate that proves that it was logged. So, if your certificate isn't provably logged to a public log, it won't be trusted. Where we stand today, Let's Encrypt voluntarily submits to all CT logs because we believe in the value of transparency and being public. And we're working on adding this little proof that certificates were logged so that in April, when the flag is flipped, our certificates will continue to be trusted. And that's also one where we've been a little bit of a leader. I think we were the first CA to voluntarily log all certificates. Symantec was required to log all of their certificates as part of a remediation from some problems they had. And it's been interesting because our issuance volume is so high. We've issued more than 100 million certificates since we launched. We have 45 million active certificates at this time. We've actually acted as a pretty useful stress test on all the log implementations, and I feel bad, but we've actually knocked a few of them offline. But that's led to developing better solutions and more scalable solutions, so that when CT logging becomes mandatory, systems won't fail out from under us. And already CT logging has been really valuable to the HTTPS ecosystem because people investigating the logs have found certificates that were incorrectly issued from a number of CAs, and that's had consequences for them, and they've had to change their practices, and some have actually been removed from trust stores because of it. There's a couple big things coming up for us. One is we're actually going to run our own certificate transparency log in addition to submitting to other people's. So we'll help contribute back to that ecosystem. And we're also working on something called multi-viewpoint validation. So when it comes down to it, even at a well-run CA, the validation process to get a certificate is kind of weak. The whole point of an HTTPS certificate is to help protect you against a man in the middle who might tamper with your traffic. But when Let's Encrypt goes out to validate that you really own your domain, say it requests a file from example.com, that's just a single HTTP request from one point on the internet. And if somebody is doing a man in the middle at that moment, they can insert their own validation data and they can get their own certificate for that domain name. Or they don't even have to interrupt at the moment you're validating example.com. Once they have a man in the middle position, they can trigger their own validation. So, and in fact, there's various ways to do this. You don't even necessarily have to be on the network. You can use BGP, which is the protocol that determines how the internet is routed. And it's actually shockingly easy to advertise malicious BGP routes and say, these IP addresses should actually come through my network before going on to the rest of the world. And so some researchers this summer demonstrated how to use BGP hijacking to get certificates for domains they don't control. So one of our mitigations to that is when we validate a domain name, we actually want to go through multiple paths so that it's harder to stand in the middle and change the response. It's definitely not impossible. With BGP hijacking, you can make those requests come to you no matter where on the web they came from. However, this would make BGP hijacking attacks noisier and harder, and not necessarily harder to implement, but harder to hide. The other big change coming up for us, so the protocol we implement called ACME is getting close to last call at the IETF. And so internally we're calling this ACME v2. There are some significant protocol changes involved based on further input we've gotten from other CAs about how their issuance flow goes. So since we want more CAs to implement the protocol so we can have a really robust ecosystem of clients and servers working together, we're fine revising our protocol. One of the advantages that come with this new protocol is it's much simpler for us to implement wildcard validation. So a wildcard certificate is one that's good for a domain name and all of its subdomains. So it has star.example.com. So we're planning to start offering wildcard certificates in January, linked to the launch of our Acme v2 API. So that's kind of a brief intro to Let's Encrypt and Cert Bot, and I'd like to turn it over to the audience for questions.
So I have a question. I was wondering, the first thing that my skeptical friends say about Let's Encrypt, because I tell everybody about it now when they need to convert to HTTPS. And they're concerned about giving, trusting the EFF, like trusting all of these certificate authorities that we didn't want to trust in the first place. So could you help me understand the difference in what you're doing, so I can answer their questions better?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people ask us this question. For EFF spent several years tearing down the certificate authority ecosystem and saying, here are all the problems with it, and here is why it's so dangerous. And those things still all apply. I think the conclusion we've come to is that you don't encrypt the web with the crypto system you wish you had. You encrypt the web with the crypto system you have. It's remarkable how far we've gotten with the web PKI as it is today. And while the trust problems inherent in that ecosystem haven't changed in quantitative ways, they have changed in qualitative ways. So much more oversight is being applied to the CAs, and the chance of a CA being caught in bad behavior is much higher. And in fact, we've seen that happen several times, and we've seen there be real consequences. So we think the web PKI is gradually getting stronger. And then the question is, also, I think there's an implicit question of, can we build a better PKI? Can we build a system that is more robust against malicious CAs? And I've done a lot of thinking about this recently, and there were some interesting experiments in the 2011 time period about alternate trust models. So like convergence was a big popular one where you would rely on a network of notaries to authenticate that a given server has a given public key, which is kind of like the multi-viewpoint approach we have today, but had some important properties like trust agility. I think there's still potential to build and harden that stuff. I think the main one today is certificate transparency. So essentially, if a CA is going to do evil, we should at least guarantee that they'll be caught at it.
Okay, so that transparency and stuff, that's largely from the work that you guys were doing over the years?
So certificate transparency, that project is mainly being driven by work at Google, and is, I think, inspired in part by some prototypes that Peter Eckersley built a while ago.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could give an example of a type of attack that can occur if someone gets a certificate for a domain that they don't own? Yeah.
So actually a good example of this is the DigiNotar hack in 2010 or 2011. DigiNotar was a certificate authority. Somebody broke into one of their resellers' systems and was able to convince them that they were authorized to get a certificate for mail.google.com and mail.yahoo.com and addons.mozilla.org, a bunch of domains where valuable stuff happens. So we can focus, for instance, on addons.mozilla.org. The DigiNotar hacker appeared to be Iranian, either associated with the government or just somebody who believed in the government's interest, mainly because when we got pingbacks from browsers, so I think Google was reporting that they were collecting this data about where these certificates were seen. They were largely in Iran. And so somebody with network access, to be in a man-in-the-middle position, could intercept requests for those domains and serve up this certificate that included that domain name plus their public key, instead of the real public keys of the real servers. So in the example of addons.mozilla.org, somebody's Firefox browser might reach out and say, I want an update for this extension. And the fake man-in-the-middle server would successfully complete that connection as if it were the real server, and would say, here's your update, and include malicious code. And because at the time, Firefox extensions had virtually unlimited execution ability, that could take over your whole computer. What's nice, Firefox just launched a more limited web extensions API that does limit the harm of malicious extensions. If they were to do that, for example, with a webmail domain, they would be able to steal your cookies and then subsequently pretend to be you and read all your mail. Yeah, Nico. Could you speak up?
Yes, so to have your own CA, you have to have a relationship with some sort of browser consortium. Is that right?
Yeah, so the question is essentially, how do you become your own CA? It's complicated, but to be a CA in a meaningful sense means that your certificates are trusted by popular browsers. And in most browsers today, trust a list of CAs provided by the operating system. So for instance, Microsoft has a list of trusted CAs, and Apple has a list of trusted CAs. The big exception there is Firefox has its own list. So regardless of what operating system you're on, you use the Firefox list. Google does not yet have its own root program, but it seems like they participate pretty heavily in the regulation of how CAs behave, because they kind of get a veto. Even if the operating system trusts a CA, the browser can choose to distrust it. So there's the long road to becoming a CA, which is you build out your secure data center, you buy your hardware security modules, you issue your root certificates and generate your root keys, and you build out all that business infrastructure, and then you apply to what are called the root programs, so Microsoft, Apple, Firefox, and to some extent Google, and you say, will you include my root key, my root certificate? And each root program has its own criteria, but they tend to be pretty similar. But it can take months to years to get accepted. And then once you're accepted, it can take a long time until a majority of the web has up-to-date operating systems and trust you. So for instance, somebody running Windows 7 wouldn't trust your certificates right away. So the quick path to becoming a certificate authority is to get an existing certificate authority to vouch for you by what's called cross-signing your certificate. And so usually that involves some sort of payment. So Let's Encrypt took the fast path. There's an existing CA called IdenTrust. And so we made a deal with them, and they cross-signed our certificate so that we could get trusted right away. We're also pursuing independent addition to the trust stores so that we won't need that to rely on that cross-signature, and we'll be in them on our own.
I don't know if anybody has another question. I was curious, what's my other question? So do you know how Let's Encrypt, first of all, is the relationship between Let's Encrypt and EFF, is it just, are they two separate organizations, or is it one organization?
That's a good question. Sorry I didn't make that clear at the beginning. So Let's Encrypt is an independent, Let's Encrypt is part of ISRG, which is an independent nonprofit. ISRG was founded by EFF, Mozilla, Cisco, Akamai, and the University of Michigan. So they're all founding sponsors, and then has a bunch of other sponsors at various levels that keep it going. So I'm employed by EFF, but I work mainly on Let's Encrypt as a part of our sponsorship.
Oh, I see. EFF sponsors ISRG.
Yeah.
I love it. I don't know if anybody has other questions, but do you know how it changed the market when you guys launched? Are you tracking, like, because I imagine if you start giving away something for free that previously cost hundreds of dollars, it would just like decimate all the other players in the space. Has that happened? Is that on its way to happening?
So it's actually, it's funny when I say I'm pleased to see that it hasn't had a devastating effect on our competitors, because it would actually be bad if Let's Encrypt became the only CA. We want some diversity and competition in the market. And there are a few reasons why I think that devastation hasn't happened. I think a big part of it is the market for certificates is divided into 2 or 2.5 levels. There's domain validated certificates where all you're vouching for is a domain name and a public key. And then there's extended validation where you're vouching for a domain name and the name of a company in a certain location. And there's extra validation associated with that. Generally, you view some articles of incorporation, you call someone on the phone. It's a lot more work, and you pay a lot more money for those types of certificates. So in the domain validation market, prices have been coming down for years because it's a process you can automate pretty well.
Right.
And so Let's Encrypt essentially is just another point on this progress. The existing CAs have seen this and have been moving more of their business towards this higher margin EV extended validation area. And so one way you can see kind of the evidence that Let's Encrypt hasn't really destroyed the market for commercial CAs is Symantec, which is one of the biggest, oldest CAs. Well, they bought VeriSign, which was one of the biggest, oldest CAs. They sold their CA component to another CA, DigiCert, for roughly on the order of $1 billion just this summer. So definitely the market still believes that there is value in commercial CAs. The other useful bit of data on that front is a colleague of mine did an analysis of all the domain names for which Let's Encrypt certificates were issued and compared those to previously existing certificates and found that something like 92 or 93% of certificates that Let's Encrypt had issued over the first 6 months or so of its existence were issued to domain names that had never had a certificate before. So in other words, none of those certificates were taking any business away from anyone else. They were purely bringing online new encrypted websites or encrypting websites that hadn't been encrypted before. I think we're expanding the market as opposed to eating into it.
That's awesome. Thank you. Another thing I noticed is that I've installed C certificates from, all kinds of different CAs, including Let's Encrypt, and I've noticed that increasingly lately, the Let's Encrypt certificates perform better across a wider range of devices, meaning that for whatever reason, and this is just something I don't understand why this happens, like you'll get the green lock on a lot of devices and a lot of browsers with, for example, like cheap certs or whatever, cheapcerts.com, I forgot the name of this. But then with Let's Encrypt, it consistently appears green across all of them. What is the reason for that? Are they just not filtering into all the lists?
So you're saying Let's Encrypt is green in more browsers?
More browsers, that's right. Yeah. So it's on mobile devices and even old mobile devices, and like for some reason it's always got the green lock. Whereas even what's the major one that was like I forgot the name of it, but it was a really well trusted one, and on some old Samsung devices, it didn't load correctly, right? So even though it was an older CA, it wouldn't work on those older browsers. And even though Let's Encrypt was a newer CA, it seemed to render the green lock perfectly on those older browsers. So I'm just wondering why that was happening.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question. When you visit the sites with cheapcerts.com or whatever, do you get a full page like there is, the certificate is not valid, or is it
no,
the green lock is crossed out or grayed out?
It's I guess both have happened. It was either an error that would go up, or it just wasn't a green lock, and then the thing would load anyway.
So when there's no error, but you don't get the green lock and like the word secure, for instance, in Chrome. Yeah. What that means is there was no certificate error, but the page you're on was HTTPS, and that it embedded images, for instance, that used HTTP. So that has nothing to do with the CA that was chosen. It's more about the design of the website.
Okay.
And if I had to hazard a guess, I would say Let's Encrypt encrypted websites tend to be newer, and so they tend to be designed with HTTPS from the beginning. So it has fewer of those what are called mixed content errors.
Cool.
Whereas older sites might not.
Nice.
Or might have more.
So I just have one final question unless somebody
has
has a question.
Let's give it to Ken first, and then we can come back to you.
Cool.
I'd read some stories earlier in the year that were somewhat critical of Let's Encrypt, something along the lines of a bunch of certificates that were issued to PayPal phishing sites, and I was wondering if there was was that a legitimate issue, and is there something that's been done to mitigate that in the future?
Yeah, so this is actually an issue I feel very strongly about, is like the role that CAs should play in phishing. And to look at it in context, you have to kind of go back to when SSL was first developed. And at that time, it was thought of as a solution only for e-commerce. Basically, the problem was everybody had been told, don't put your credit card on the internet, it's dangerous, which was correct because the internet was unencrypted and the web was unencrypted. And so the idea was, well, just for order checkout pages, we'll use SSL there. And the only people who have any legitimate use for certificates are businesses with checkout pages. And so it was feasible at that time for CAs to add on this additional trustworthiness check. Like basically, we're only going to do business with businesses that we think are good. They're not going to scam you, or it's not actually some hacker or phisher. And then we'll also try to revoke those certificates if we find out contradicting information. And that was 20-ish years ago now, and the nature of the web and the nature of encryption has changed. I think one of the big changes that happened in 2010, 2011 is that we realized actually our social media and email are in many ways a juicier target for interception than credit card information, and so that needs to be encrypted too. And we're actually trying to get to a web where everything is encrypted. So in that world where everything is encrypted, are CAs the right place to police phishing? There's a lot of places in the stack where you can do it, and there's a lot of places in the stack that do it. You can address it at the registrar level by doing UDRP takedowns. That's the Unified Dispute Resolution Protocol. You can do it at the hosting provider level by sending abuse letters to hosting providers. You can do it at the browser level by using things like smart browsing, safe browsing, and smart screen. Smart Screen is Microsoft's solution. Safe Browsing is Google's solution, which is integrated into Chrome, Firefox, and Safari. And what these client-side solutions do is they basically have a list of phishing sites or reported phishing or malware sites that they update on the server side, and they ship out an encoded form of that list to browsers. So the browser is responsible for checking these. And as just one example of why this type of checking is better, when your browser visits a site that's been reported as phishing, it can actually pop up a full page, this is probably phishing, you probably don't want to go here, go back. And then you also have the choice. For instance, if you really need some information on the site and you're really sure it's not phishing, you can choose to click through, but you have the right context and the right information for that. Whereas if a CA had issued and then revoked a certificate for that site, one of two things might happen. One is nothing, because some browsers actually don't check revocation information, and the other is you might get an error that says this certificate has been revoked, don't connect to this website because your data could be intercepted, which is actually the wrong message and gives the wrong idea. The other reason CAs are the wrong level to solve this is that actually, let me give a few. So research has shown that users don't actually notice the green lock, which is one of the reasons we want to get to 100% encrypted web. We don't want people to be responsible for checking the URL bar all the time, because we know that's a task humans are bad at. And so if you're a phisher and say the CA anti-phishing ecosystem is perfected and there's, you can't convince anybody to get you a cert for any of the domain names you've tried, in today's web at least, you can go ahead and just use an HTTP website and you'll still get reasonably good conversions. Now that'll probably change in the future web, and your site might actually get blocked without an HTTPS certificate. So the other aspect is, what information do CAs have available to them, in order to prevent phishing? Really very little. They deal with the site once at validation time, and they say, okay, you own this site. I'm vouching for the fact that this is your domain name, buycheapstuff.com, and this is your public key. I'm not vouching for, do you follow good practices? Are you a scammer? Any of that. Even if the CA were to come back and revisit after the fact and say, does this look like a phishing page? Phishers now engage in very sophisticated cloaking, right? So they will serve a different page to somebody they know who is checking for phishing than to the rest of the world. And anti-phishing programs can develop, cloaking detection and avoidance. You can get around this, but you can see that this anti-phishing program quickly becomes expensive. Now, if it were worthwhile, if it really reduced phishing a lot, maybe that expense would be worthwhile. But remember now also there's about 100 CAs, depending on how you count. And so every one of them has to implement anti-phishing protections at least as good as every other one of them. And whichever one of them has the lowest, phishers will go through there. And basically if you get bounced from one CA, you can go to another CA and work around them that way. So it's our belief that not only is the certificate system the wrong place to enforce anti-phishing measures, it's also an enormous cost to the ecosystem. And so if we want to encrypt the whole web, we want to actually make that available on kind of level grounds to everybody. And there are better solutions. So I would really like to see those, the existing solutions be the most effective ones. There's also, like I said, this is an issue I care about a lot. Yeah, I think one of the big issues we face when we talk about an all-encrypted web is kind of the weak links and free speech issue, which is every link along the way from your hosting provider to your ISP to your CA can potentially take you offline. So your CA can potentially take you offline by revoking your certificate. And so we take that responsibility very seriously, and we try to avoid revoking spuriously as much as possible. And so that involves ruling out large categories of revocation. Another reason why the CA ecosystem is the wrong place to enforce anti-phishing, by the way, is it's not granular enough. So it only applies to the hostname level. So you can imagine if somebody puts their phishing HTML on s3.amazonaws.com, revoking that certificate is not a practical way to stop that phishing attack because it would take down an enormous part of the web. And so that's why you need more granular systems to take those things down.
I'm curious about if has Let's Encrypt become like a super high value target for hackers and because of the volume of certs you guys issue? And then are you seeing that? Are you dealing with a constant onslaught?
Yeah, so any CA is inherently a high-value target for hackers, regardless of how many certificates they issue, right? A compromise of Let's Encrypt would let you issue fake certificates for any domain name you want, which is very powerful, but you would get the same result from compromising any CA. So we take that risk very seriously. We have stringent physical access controls, we have stringent information security controls, one of the interesting parts about that is also certificate transparency plays a role in that. So especially once certificate transparency is required for all certificates, attacking any CA, whether it's Let's Encrypt or another, would let you issue a certificate, but it wouldn't be valid in a lot of browsers unless you publicly logged it. And that would allow the owners, the proper owners of the site for which you issued to respond and get that certificate revoked.
I see, but if the system you described earlier with the CAA becomes standard, then specific CAs would become more valuable targets than others, right? Because
so it depends on what level of compromise you mean. One level of compromise would get some of the CAA systems, but not the ones that validate the CAA record, because remember, it's the responsibility of the CA to check this CAA record. So if you fully compromise the systems, you can convince them, oh, maybe I don't need to check that and I'll issue anyhow. So in general, we tend to model kind of the worst case compromise, which would involve extracting our, signing private keys and using them to sign anything in your own system, separate from our CAA lookups.
Cool. The other thing I wanted to ask you about while I had you are just sort of more about the basics about, because we're trying to get more people. You guys hit 1 million or something recently, right? You hit a milestone.
100 million.
100 million, whoops, big difference. 100 million. So what's the next step for this project? I mean, the project was arguably successful. And what is the next step for Let's Encrypt?
Yeah, so I outlined a couple of our big next steps. One is the multi-viewpoint validation, which is going to improve the security of this ecosystem a lot. Launching a certificate transparency log of our own is another big one. Embedding the proofs of CT logging. And we're also generally trying to look at ways we can improve the validation process even more than multi-viewpoint. Ideally, we'd love to find ways that, once a site is already kind of in the HTTPS ecosystem, they have some like managed key material that can be used to prove their identity for future validations in a way much stronger than just going across the internet based on the DNS, because DNS can be spoofed. And of course, scaling is always a huge thing. Like that's actually, we spend a decent amount of time on an ongoing basis making sure we can issue for the next billion certificates, because we have to re-engineer our systems and make sure we grow efficiently. We don't want to have to raise 10 times the money in order to issue 10 times the number of certificates. Yeah.
Thanks for the introduction to what you're facing in the near future. Are you also taking a look into the more distant obstacles, perhaps game changers such as quantum computing changing the way encryption works or is broken, and maybe the decentralized web? Like, what big obstacles or interesting things are you seeing in the future?
Yeah, I think quantum computing is definitely like one of the huge known unknowns in the world of encryption that we in the broader HTTPS ecosystem worry about a lot. We're not very actively involved in remediations there. We've kind of followed the cryptographic developments. There are some post-quantum encryption technologies being developed, but none of them are really practical for the web today. But when they are, we'll definitely take a keen interest in implementing them.
Okay. All right. Well, Jacob, thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Oh, one more thing I forgot to mention at the beginning, but EFF is hiring. We have 2 staff technologist positions open, so if you'd like to work with me, come apply. EFF.org/about/jobs.
Okay, that is huge. That's a huge one. Staff technologist is the fun job. You have to go, I mean, it's not always the fun job, but it's technically, it's a range of different things. You never know what different projects you're going to work on. You get to go figure things out one day, or you'll just be able to kind of make something better the next day, and it's a very interesting range of things. I've known the staff technologist over the years, so this is a big deal. And 2, how many do you guys have now? There used to be 1.
I think we've got about 8 at the moment.
8 of them. That's awesome. So EFF, it's really exciting to see all the exciting things you're doing. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Yeah.